This is the Venturing Angler Podcast. I'm Tim Harden. In this episode, we're talking to Ron Sorensen from Limay River Ranch about fly fishing on the Limay River in Argentina. Let's chat with Ron. Okay, we're here with Ron Sorensen from Limay River Ranch in Argentina. Ron, welcome back to the Venturing Angler Podcast.
Thank you, Tim. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
So last time we spoke was actually in Argentina, which was nice, and we spoke about a number of different rivers in your area of Argentina. Now we'll focus on one. First, where is this river?
So the Limay River is it's the only tailwater that we fish in our area, in the area around San Martin and Bariloche, which is considered the northern part of Patagonia. And the lower Limay River, the Limay Medio, as it's called, the middle Limay, is a tailwater that's formed from the confluence of the Cojuncura River and the Limay. And the Cojuncura River starts up in the northern part of our zone of operations. It comes out of the Illuminae Lake, and then the Illuminae, when it joins with Chimuin, then from there down, it's traditionally called the Cojuncura. And then the Cojuncura enters into this reservoir system with Limay, which flows out from Nahuelhuapi Lake near Bariloche. And the two come together in the Alicura Reservoir, and then out from there flows the Limay Medio, or the Limay tailwater.
How big is this river?
Well, the river, it's ginormous. It's low flow, so it's a dam. It's a hydroelectric dam, and they manipulate flows in order to generate electricity. And at low minimum flow, the river's at 200 cubic meters per second, so that more or less roughly calculates out to about 8,500 cubic feet per second. And so that's low minimum flows, and then it can go from there all the way up to about 38,000 cubic feet per second. So when they open the floodgates to produce a lot of energy, I mean, the river's just massive.
and it travels a good distance too. Do you know about how many miles it is downstream?
I don't. It flows all the way up to the provincial capital of Neuquén.
Oh. And
there the Limay joins with the Neuquén River, and then from there it flows east all the way to the Atlantic. So, so it starts, the watershed actually, starts up in the Andes and goes all the way. This is the primary watershed out of this sort of northern zone of Patagonia.
Wow. Patagonia is such a big region, and Argentina is so large. Would San Martin be the closest city or town of that has an airport and is maybe perhaps better known to people?
Yeah, I mean, actually, well, San Martin or Bariloche are the most well-known cities that are close to the river. You could actually triangulate the river between San Martin de los Andes, Bariloche, and the provincial capital of Neuquén. And actually, the section river that we fish is actually about a half an hour closer to the provincial capital than San Martin is. But San Martin is a good reference point for sort of at least getting a general idea of where the river is.
Okay, and how far from San Martin is it?
Well, drive time, it's 2.5 hours from San Martin to the river, and then it's about 2 hours, 10 minutes from Neuquén, the provincial capital. So
let's talk about some of the details about this river. I would say I don't know when I first started paying attention to Patagonia, but I think this was the first river I'd ever heard of. What makes it well known, and what's the river? I mean, you described some of it already, but what's the river like in general?
Sure. Well, I think lots of people, have heard of the Limay, but primarily I think, those references are to the upper Limay near Bariloche, which, just like the Boca de Chimuin, all through the, sort of the late 50s when, uh, some of the Argentine anglers were getting the first Americans down, these are places that they were showing the Joe Brooks and some of the first venturing anglers. They were fishing these bocas, but the Limay tailwater, which is out in the desert, really wasn't essentially created until I think the dam was built like in the late 70s. So it really is a relatively new, fishery in a sense. So when we first started fishing it in the early 2000s, I mean, the Argentines, knew about this river, and they would target it in the fall. This quote fall run of these migratory browns, coming up out of Chacon Reservoir, because it's actually there's a whole series of these reservoirs, and we're just fishing one section. It's about 56 miles long between this upper dam and the Chacon Reservoir. So the Limay was, pretty well known, but just for the sort of April, May, late season run where, all the Argentines would go and swing streamers for these monster brown trout. Um, but when I was first went to the river, really from the early 2000s for the next 10 years, there was really nobody there midsummer. um and it's a tailwater, which is sort of unique and amongst the normal average rivers in Patagonia that would go to fish, say the Rio Grande or the upper Furulafu and Skell's another one, but for the most part, people are fishing spring creeks or freestones, not tailwaters. So, I mean, I think the most striking aspect of the river is just how incredibly clear it is. I mean, the reservoirs, Chocon, if you just sort of glanced on the map, it's almost the size of Rhode Island. I mean, these are just huge, huge reservoirs. So, the water has all this time. The upper Limay is crystal clear. The Cojuncura's always has a bit of touch of color to it, but the Alicura Reservoir gives certainly plenty of time for all that siltation to, sort of filter out of the Cojuncura water, and it comes out of the bottom of the dam into the Limay, you know, gin clear, like like the Chimween or the Trafua River or the Rivadavia, for example, just like New Zealand, gin clear waters. So that's probably the most striking, is to have a river that's that big, but that incredibly clear. I mean, you can be in the boat and look down and see every single pebble, 14 feet below you on the bottom of the river. So I think that's really what is somewhat, so unique, is that how big it is, and yet, how absolutely perfectly clear.
You've been fishing this river for about or almost 20 years.
Yeah, I think the first time I went to the river was with then friend and who was to become a guide for us, Javier Jaggy Urbanski. People call him Jaggy, who was still working as an aquatic biologist for the province of Neuquén at the time. And they had to do, because the dam's actually privately owned, and the contract with the province is, part of that contract is that SEAN, which is this group of biologists, aquatic biologists, they would do quarterly sort of impact and studies on the river to see if and how, the management of the water, how it was, if and how it was affecting the fishery. So Jaggy actually invited me. The first time I went was, I think, in 2002, and it was just to go with this group of biologists to help them collect data on the river, which I thought was totally fascinating. And and we and I learned a lot about the river the very first time we went and saw it, and everything I learned made me want to come back and fish it more and start to explore it. And and that's essentially what we did. So it was all the genesis or the seed of that, of this whole, exodus, or this whole experience, has really started with that very first trip with Jaggy.
And prior to that, you were guiding on the Henry's Fork in Idaho. You've spent millions of hours on rivers in Montana. That's an exaggeration, but why is it that you want to be on the other side of the world from some of the world's best trout waters to be down there? What drives that?
Well, I mean, the I guess my involvement in Patagonia goes back to '96. So yes, I had started guiding in the early '90s and worked for Mike Lawson down on the Henry's Fork. Had been exposed to the the Madison and the Henry's Fork, and a little bit on the South Fork, the Teton, Beaverhead, Big Hole. Those fisheries I had all seen, and even the Missouri by the time I first went down to Argentina. But the reason for going to Argentina was that it was the perfect match for the U.S. summer. So seasons are flip flopped. So in the southern hemisphere, their summer runs, starting November is when the season starts, and it runs through May. So starts, spring through, late fall down in Patagonia. So it was the perfect match to figure out how I was going to keep myself busy and employed year round.
Yeah, yeah, it makes sense. But you probably have that as less of a concern, but more of a passion for the region.
Well, I mean, it was, sometimes you just need a cover story, right? You,
Nice.
you need to have an alibi, right, for what you're up to. And I mean, I guess that's the beauty of making your passion your job, and or your job is your passion. Those are, they're intertwined. So, so yeah, I mean, you don't become a fishing guide because you think you're going to make a lot of money. You do it because you love what you do, and that's enough to check all your boxes for you. So I mean, I ended up in Argentina, and the Limay of all the rivers was really actually the last one that I was sort of exposed to. I had, from '96 on, was getting my arms around the Majeo and the Chimoin, the Cojuncura, the Kaleafu, all these other famous rivers, and really at that time frame, there was nobody fishing the Limay Medio, this tailwater out in the middle of the desert. Um, so when Jaggy took me there, it was sort of this exposure to a whole fishery that I'd heard of, that's sort of how up in Montana we all go fish for steelhead, after the guiding season's over in October. Well, this was a similar deal. This is sort of what all the guides did after the guide season was wrapping up in April. This is where people would go fish for 3 or 4 days and try for a big fish. So again, it wasn't an unknown river, but it wasn't known as having resident rainbows, or really being a viable fishery for the rest of the year.
We've been on this river together, and one of the things that I remember, but I also noticed yesterday when I was sorting through photos from the trip, you're really, really happy on this river. It. I don't want to call it your happy place for you, but I saw somebody who's been on this river many, many times over decades, giddy like it was your first time. What is it when you're about to put the boat in on the Limay that gets you excited about the river?
Well, I think what's so unique about the Limay is just how dynamic it is. So, it's this odd combination between, say, like, taking the Henry's Fork or the Missouri, which are both amazing dry fly fisheries that I've loved for, since the beginning of my career. So you take that and then you blend it essentially with, sort of like the pseudo steelhead fishery. I mean, granted, there aren't steelhead in it, but these big browns, that come up out of the Chocon Reservoir, they really, in many ways behave like steelhead in the, they're there in the summer, and the water's warm, and you can wet wade for them, and that they'll eat dry flies. So they're super aggressive, fish when the mood strikes them. So I think it's a combination, in that there's, you know, they bump the water up and down, just like, maybe an equivalent river would be like the White River in Arkansas. And so you have, these incredible hatches. I mean, one of the things I learned on that very first trip with Jaggy was, they're collecting data, and, we had actually fishermen stations where we'd go to certain, runs, and then we'd log in angler hours so that they would get like a catch rate per angler hour invested or what have you. And then, you catch a fish, and then that actually like take, they'd weigh, measure, length, girth, and then they'd take a scale sample off of each fish. So then they'd have, they could actually read these scale samples. So when I, caught my first rainbow on the Limay, Jaggy's sitting there, and he's like, well, that's a 3-year-old fish. I was like, Jaggy, I mean, I've been witness to, some of the most productive tailwaters in the whole American West. None of them have a growth rate like that. I mean, I think, the bighorn, I mean, I think a 3-year-old fish is, 14 or 15 inches. And, it's hard to, imagine a river richer than the bighorn. I mean, there's, I don't know what the growth rates are on the frying pan or some of these other, tailwaters that we have in the States. But I mean, it's at least as good or better than anything it was better than anything I had ever heard of. So I honestly didn't believe him. I thought he was pulling my leg. And sure enough, I had never seen a fish scale under a microscope, but you could see those growth rings, and you can actually count the dark growth rings, and it was true. He sent me the scale sample, and there it was. The fish was 3 years old and was 17 inches. So I think that belies, this amazing, food source, which, Jaggy, initially they were, cutting these fish open to see what they were eating. And they're doing it all, like 98% is all on, caddis and mayflies. So, and the fact that the river's so large that I think it holds that water temperature within the, a trout's, peak metabolistic, temperature range. It holds it there 365 days a year. So those fish don't have sort of winter or, midsummer doldrums where their metabolism basically is telling them not to eat. So, so they're growing year round on this amazing wealth of bugs. So I think that, part for me of what makes the Limay so attractive and so exciting is the fact that, the river, normally, maybe it'll go from 8,000 and it'll bump to 10 or 11 on a normal day. So, you get in the water and you're not actually sure exactly what you're going to find when you get there. I mean, it's, you sort of have to get your feet wet every single time that you're there and figure out, okay, well, what are they doing today? So it sort of makes it impossible to fall into some rut. And you sort of have to, bring all your angling skills to bear on every single day that you're there, which I think is, just which makes it just, unavoidably fascinating. So I mean, this is part of what makes the Henry's Fork so fun, is because you'll have these layered hatches, and just because the fish were on PMD spinners yesterday doesn't mean that they're not going to eat spent caddis today. So I mean, that's the appeal of the Henry's Fork, is that you can have different fish locked into different bugs, and you have to figure out what that one's eating, and it doesn't necessarily apply to all the rest of the fish. So it's that challenge, I think, that makes it so exciting. And then of course, when you throw in the possibility of, hooking, brown trout that can certainly go well beyond 30 inches, I mean, it's an amazing, potent combo that that I think
Right.
would get anybody's blood pumping.
So huge browns and rainbows. What are the biggest of those species that you've seen?
I think the biggest rainbow that we ever caught was landed was like 24, 25, which honestly I think was a rainbow up out of the reservoir.
Huh.
The average rainbows, really peak out, like at 21, 22, 23. But even those are, we might, get a few of those a season. These are pure strain McLeod River rainbows. So they tend to, most of them tend to die after 4 years.
Wow.
So that's really the limiting factor on how big they get. It's not, the food source, I assume, I don't know if the rainbows down in Jurassic Lake, if that's a different genetic strain, and they, when they put the eggs in that whole systems, all those river systems down there, like the Santa Cruz, if those are essentially different, a different rainbow strain than what we have in the north. But at least, speaking of what I can speak of is that the rainbows in our area are all that pure strain McLeod, that was brought down, in the early 1900s. So, most of the fish, really peak out just under 20 inches. And then you'll get, maybe, who knows, 3% of the trout population will get one more year, and those will get to be that, 21, 22, 23. But that's really sort of where the rainbows max out. But the browns, you have resident browns that live in the river permanently year round, and then you have these browns that move up out of the reservoir. And so, again, referring to Jaggy and the aquatic biologist of Ken, like a 3-year-old fish coming up out of Chacon Reservoir is a 23-inch fish.
Yeah.
So they've got, they're getting big really fast. I mean, some of the fish, their bodies are outgrowing their cartilage. Like the muscle of their body their cartilage, their heads can't keep up with it. So a lot of them will have like these humps, right behind in back of their head. So it's just amazing the growth rates. And so I think the biggest fish that we've landed with a client that we put it on as tape on was, like just at like 33 inches. Um, I've landed a fish, certainly bigger than that. We've seen fish in the river that I would, if I had to guesstimate, we're probably in the 37, 38-inch range. And,
Wow.
over the years, the Argentines have, landed, fish that, I've seen pictures of that I would probably guess were, around 40 inches. So, I mean, there was just monster brown trout in the river.
And then I saw you catch one. I can't remember the name of it. There's a fish that's native down there.
Yep, percas.
Okay.
A perca looks a little bit. People call them perch. If you ask for somebody to translate it for you, they'd say it was a perch, but they look a lot more like and there's a small mouth and a large mouth version. I mean, but they seem to me they appear to be a lot more like like a bass or a walleye than they do any perch that I've ever seen. So there's the perca, and then you have these pajare, which if you looked in the fishing license book or whatever, they have a picture of all the different species. And the pajare, they name it a silverfish, but it looks kind of like one of our whitefish, with it has like a tarpon mouth, so it doesn't have a bottom feeding mouth. It has a
Huh.
this sort of mouth that unfolds. It looks more like a tarpon's mouth. So they actually will feed on the surface, and they're actually a favorite bait fish for those big browns. They love to chase those pajare around.
When you described the river earlier as being in the desert, I think what a lot of people imagine sometimes unfairly with the desert is a lot of, flat land and stuff, but there's some really striking landscape. What's the landscape there like? How does the river work with the natural environment down there?
So yeah, so the river is out in this sort of high mountain or high desert scrub is kind of, where if you're driving out to the river, you're up on these big, sort of mesas, rolling hills. It reminds me of, more like Eastern Wyoming. If I had to try to compare it to something, maybe parts of Utah or Colorado. But the river itself, you're sort of in this, up on these big high mesas. And then when you drop into the river valley itself, well, the river's, been acting on the landscape over the eons, and it's, eating its way. And there's parts where you're sort of in this broad valley, just below the dam, maybe for the first 15 miles, it's sort of, out in the valley's much more open, and then it starts buttressing up against these big, huge, red, sort of, and it's a mix. It seems like some of it's sandstone and other is this sort of ochre, rock that in these massive, probably 40 to 60 foot, rock faces that and sheer face rock cliffs that it cuts out. And so through most of the river valley, it's running up against these big cliffs, and you get these large rocks that sort of as it's eaten away at these faces that'll crumble down. And there's actually sections where it looks like it's odd how you have the rock strata, but then you have these like almost vertical breaks in the rock, so it looks like you'll get maybe like a quarter mile where it looks like a Roman wall, where these cubed blocks along these shorter rock faces that the river's running in. It's really pretty unique, the the landscape around the river.
Yeah, and I remember one area right around the takeout just had this beautiful dramatic cliffs, and I think a history of you guys getting some pretty good fish on that one last cast moment on that stretch.
Well, and that's where the rock faces is sort of corral the river in a sense. So that's oftentimes where where the river couldn't wander as much. Then that's where it gouges out. And I mean, some of these pools have to be 30, 40 feet deep against some of those rock faces. So it's that, and the fact that you have these huge blocks that have tumbled down to the river makes for, I mean, an awesome holding water too. So they can lie just off the heavy current, but be tucked into some of these rock, these almost rock gardens that the river is in eating away these cliffs. It's sort of created these whole rock gardens down there that are amazing holding water for the even the biggest fish.
On a typical day out on the water, how would you normally fish this river? When it comes to flies, gear. I mean, I know you said the river changes quite a bit, but for those who might be planning a trip or thinking about coming down, what sense would you give just generally about those things?
Sure. So I mean, I think it's the only river I've really legitimately been on where you can go from 5x to 0x within a given day. So you're gonna so a big part of fishing the river, and we were lucky that in essence we actually you know we brought molds down. We started building road drift boats in Argentina, and the fact that we weren't in rafts or catarafts or whatever, where carrying a bunch of spare rods is a bit cumbersome. I mean, in a lot of ways, having those boats down there really made our exploration of the river feasible, so that we could actually carry. So we'll carry on a given day. We'll carry a couple five weights with some with floating lines and lighter leaders to in the event that the caddis start to come off. You'll carry some six weights with some larger terrestrials that you could even drop on. Drop some nymphs on if you needed to. And then we would typically, maybe even carry a seven weight, or we evolved into carrying like light switch rods actually. So like we use those those Scott makes an amazing two-handed, like a 12.5 foot six weight. That's our, for when we're sort of searching out for some of those bigger fish. Then we really take into to using those switch rods, because you can you can teach somebody just how to overhead cast one, sorry, with like 50, 60 feet of line, and it takes a lot of the work out of, covering all this water looking for those big browns. So um, on a given day, you go try to get on a riffle to get a sense of, do you have bugs moving? Do you have a hatch happening? I mean, if you have a hatch happening, you essentially, the first indications will be when you're dropping the boat in, if, if there's caddis off the bushes, or you've got spinners staging to lay. So, your first indicators, you're already, sort of fishing those out, or, the minute you pull up to the water. But uh, you sort of have to get your feet wet to figure out, do we have bugs on the water? Are there fish rising? And so making up your plan of attack happens the moment that you arrive. But I mean, I guess that's what makes the river so unique is, there's like on the Missouri, you've got, a month where you could, you sort of have your game plan and you can apply it to, with better or less success every day, but you can use the same game plan for a full month on the Missouri. Whereas the Limay, you really have to adapt to what the river is giving you that day. So, get on your first riffle. Well, are the fish up in 2 to 4 inches, of water? Are they down on the drop off? Are they off the shelf? You really have to sort of piece that together every single day that you're on the water, and then that's gonna then dictate what tactics that you have to employ to catch them. And so that's why you need to have this massively sort of wide quiver of rods, and then apply it to use each one to apply to the day. And even it's one of the few rivers where the river can really change dramatically from what the trout are doing in the morning compared to the afternoon. So in the morning you could be fishing, you could have fish up in the shallow riffles eating caddis pupa, a mix of just under on the surface, or some mornings there's no hatch whatsoever. We have to nymph for a couple hours, but then you have lunch, and then the afternoon could be totally different, and now you're back to you're to you know fishing big chubbies, or big massive size 8 and 6 beetle patterns, Chernobyl ants, cicadas, hoppers. So your morning and your afternoon can be completely totally different. And then typically what we'll do is after we fished 100% of the river for years on end, and then you start narrowing down where those big browns want to hold day in and day out, where those productive little buckets are, the runs are. Then we'd start to specifically target, okay, well, put all the sort of normal trout rods away, let's get out this swing rod, or even the double hander. And then you'd fish these targeted spots for these big browns. And then of course if I go there for the day, I'm happy to look for 1 or 2 big browns fishing all day. But on a guide trip, we'll tend to have specific little spots where we're focused on like, okay, we'll fish this part of the river for 15-20 minutes, put that rod away. We'll go to our classic trout tactics like in between these big brown trout spots. So you try to mix it up, and vary what your fishing tactics are over the course of the day, so that you can have more action drifting in between these big brown trout spots, and hope that on every given day that you raise, or you have a shot at 1 or 2 of these big browns, but you're not dedicating your whole day to it.
Yeah, and really, I'm assuming drift boats are the way to go down there.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the ability to be able to, to cover water. I mean, the Limay is it's a fun river, and it's super wadeable, but it's so big that really to be able to get from riffle to riffle or run to run, you need to have a boat, and obviously having a hard bottom boat, a drift boat, and in our case these row skiffs, the ability to be able to hold that boat up and work the water is really just an invaluable asset. I've seen, on the windy days, some poor guy in a raft getting like, just flown down the river where, of course, on the windiest days, it's not fun, but it is feasible, which I guess that's the, sort of the operative word is that, having these boats, even in the worst conditions, it allows you to be able to work the river. So, to be able to, even if we have some guy that really prefers to wade, I'd still, you'd elect for a super short float and then you'd bounce between spots. So some of these cliffs that that we talked about earlier, you can, sort of row down, pull at the bottom of it, and then walk your way back up, and then, sight fish. Typically, when you're doing that kind of tactics, you're fishing dry droppers or, smaller dries to, rainbows that are suspended in front of or behind these little rocks or up against the bank, but that can be a, really, really fun way to target the river.
Eh, What are I was just about to ask about seasons, but before I forget, are there any notable hatches that you guys look forward to, or um, what's the bug life down there?
Yeah, so again, to go back from before, I mean, it's essentially it's all caddis and mayfly on the Limay. There are some, there's plenty of midges, but they don't seem to make up, or be a really important part of the trout's diet. So it's all mayflies and caddis. I'd say December is the strongest, hatches of caddis, and they'll go from, depending on how much hot weather we have in November, they'll go from anywhere around the 1st of December, late November, 1st of December through maybe mid to late January. And then you'll get some, those caddis are primarily, we get a little white caddis all over Patagonia, and those are at that time frame, and those are present on the Limay as well. We get like a little size 16, 18 tan caddis. And then another like size 18, like a chocolatey caddis. And those darker caddis will show up again in the fall, which, is sort of odd. I'm trying to think of another river that gets a fall, a small caddis, but certainly not, on the Madison, Missouri or Henry's Fork do we get a caddis like that. So caddis are present primarily early in the season, and then there's some, start again. We'll get a darker caddis that'll happen like sort of beginning of March, and it'll run through later March, and then the mayflies, we get like a Cahill, a light tan, like a size 16 mayfly through December and into January, and then we get a mix of like mahoganies and Cahills, a light tan mayfly again in the fall, and the mayfly spinner falls and hatches in the fall can be just, epic. They're on par with anything I've ever seen on the Missouri or Henry's Fork, for example. So there's time frames where we can, slip in behind a willow, and you can have, pods of 15, 20, fish, or, you get in some of those big cliffs, and there's a couple spots where there's, smaller and massive eddies depending on, where you are in the river, and you can get fish lined up in there eating duns and spinners as well. So the cat, like that's, I think, what really sort of held my interest on the river was these hatch sort of events, which can be as strong as any river I've seen anywhere. So that's really fun to be able to go down the river and pick off heads or select singles or come into certain spots where you can find, pods of fish rising. So that's really is a great, sort of dynamic part of that dynamic aspect of what the Limay has to offer.
You've been guiding down there for a very long time, but you decided to launch a new lodge on the Limay. Tell us about that.
Well, I mean, from the moment, those first days that I spent with Jaggy on the river, and we had one particular day where we actually dropped a boat in. At that point, we didn't have the row drift boats down there. So I had a little cataract, a little air cataract that I'd sort of smuggled into the country, and that might have been why I got invited on the trip with Jaggy, is the fact that I had a boat, and we did a 2 day float on the trip, float trip on the river, and it was one of the most insane fishing days I've ever had in my whole life. So that right there, I seeing that and knowing, how many of those big fish were in the river, I mean, that, immediately got my wheels cranking. So, we sort of had to dedicate ourselves to figuring out the river. And probably within about 5 years of, spending every free day that I could get a hall pass running over there with Diego or Jaggy, sort of once we had seen it enough, then I started, the river didn't have a lodge. It should have a lodge. This would be great. We pioneered this river, and so we sort of, probably around 2006 or so, we started, having conversation with landowners and trying to, see how we could put a deal together. And it just, it was talking to all these people, and from landowner to landowner, there was a lot of reservations. A lot of the landowners didn't actually have, title on their property, so they didn't want, sort of somebody coming in and building anything and having a sort of equal claim on the land. So it proved to be, really difficult. We wanted to stay. One thing to note is that there's a national highway that runs along the river. The river itself is actually the border between the Neuquén and the Rio Negro provinces. So the river itself is the sort of boundary between those provinces, and the national highway that comes out from the Neuquén city actually runs up the valley. So on the Neuquén side of the river, you have a paved national highway. On the other side of the river, you're in the sort of this forgotten corner of the Rio Negro province, and there's just a little dirt track over there. So from like 2005 through 2014, we sort of talked to every single landowner on the Neuquén side of the river, and we explored somewhat on the Rio Negro side, but it was quickly apparent that the logistics trying to operate on that side were so complicated that it seemed like it didn't seem like a very good place to build a lodge. So, but we were coming up blank all these years, and then had a couple talks that were where it seemed like it was going to get a deal was going to happen, and those fell through. But eventually and finally we were able to secure a long-term lease, and we were able to build a lodge and opened it. Our first clients we had this last January of 2022.
That's great. And what's the lodge itself like?
Well, we ended up going. Luckily, I've been around plenty of lodges, both in Argentina and up here, over all these years of guiding and outfitting and such. So I tried to do my best to glean what were the favorite elements of our clients. We have tons of clients up here in Montana. Oh, we love Ruby Springs. Well, Ruby Springs is actually a conglomeration of these cabins. It's not sort of a one big massive lodge, say like Henry's Fork Lodge, which is another great example of a very well done lodge and highly successful lodge. So we actually ended up going for the cabin uh, setup. So we have 6 double occupancy cabins, and then a main lodge where the dining room and the living room and the bar are. So it's sort of in a horseshoe format, in a group of poplars, sort of protected. We have these what are called chacras, which are where the landowners, the ranchers, used to overwinter, or they'd overwinter their sheep in these quads. Were sort of, they planted these poplar trees to create windbreaks and then protect the animals in the winter. So we took over one of these quads and built the lodge there.
Very cool. And What times of the year are you open?
We're open throughout the whole season. So we're open from early November all the way through the end of May with the peak season for fishing traditionally, in Patagonia is run, when we always used to get busy was, just after Christmas through, say mid to late April. But obviously the river with being able that's a tailwater, it runs clear from, throughout the whole season. I think in all my years of being down there, there's been a couple, sort of big thunderstorm flash floods where the water's gotten, off color for, a day or so. But that might happen for a day or two in the whole season, and then there's some seasons it won't happen at all. But with the caddis, the caddis hatches in December, we definitely started being able to attract a lot more people to come earlier, in December pre-Christmas. So that's definitely an important part of the season. And then, starting to have more and more people fish it later, late into April and into May. We actually started having people that were going down on dove hunts in May or mixed bag hunts in May, because that's when, you can in Entre Rios and north of Buenos Aires, you can hunt perdiz, ducks, and dove. So we started getting combo trips, for people wanting to tag on some trout fishing in May. So the season's actually quite long.
And for those who aren't familiar, it's the other side of the world, and so December is not frigid in Argentina. You're probably gonna have pretty mild weather throughout your season, much like the Rockies would be during our spring, summer, fall.
Correct. Yeah. So December actually equates to June, so December in Argentina and Patagonia is a really close equivalent to, June in Montana. So you can have, days that are in the mid 80s and plenty warm and get stretches of, maybe 3, 4 days like that. And then you have a front come through and it can, drop into the mid 50s, and the weather sort of can be all over the place. But when you get those stretches of 2 to 3, warm days, the bugs all pour off and the fishing can be fantastic. And so it'll stay summer from, somewhere from mid-December all the way through about mid-March. And then, somewhere in between, the 15th, somewhere between that second and third week of March, then you start getting our fall weather, and then it'll get progressively colder, through April and then into May. So by somewhere in that April May timeframe, then we'll start having frosts every night. But you're not at the same altitude that you are in Montana, so you don't get quite. We don't get the big snows, and we don't. It can be cold, but it's not that cold.
Right, right. Well, this has been great. For those who want to learn more about Limay River Ranch, be sure to follow at Limay River Ranch on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And then it's limayriverranch.com. Ron, it was a pleasure as always.
Well, thank you so much, Tim. It's always great to chat with you. We appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks for coming on.